Welcome to the Deep Dive. Ready to use those brains today? We're taking a deep dive into the world of knowledge engineers.
Always ready for a good deep dive.
You sent us a ton of info from RoleCatcher.com.
Yeah.
And, gotta say, that website, wow. It's like they hit the bold button on every other word.
It is a lot visually. A little intense. But hey, at least it's clear they're passionate about this field, right?
Yeah, definitely enthusiastic. So once you dig through all the bold text and flashing banners, what's the core of it? What does a knowledge engineer actually do? For those of us who don't, build AI in our basements.
Think of it less about building robots and more like building the way those robots think. Knowledge engineers take structured knowledge, all that data out there, and integrate it into systems, often using AI.
So they're like architects, but for information instead of buildings.
Exactly. They're building the framework that lets AI understand and use information to solve complex problems.
Yeah.
And RoleCatcher really emphasizes it's not just about the tech. There's a huge human element to it.
Okay, so less coding, more. Teaching a computer to think. How do you even begin to do that?
That's where things like ontologies and semantic nets come in. They're like the organizational systems for knowledge. Think about a library. You've got the Dewey Decimal System to categorize everything. Ontologies do something similar for AI, helping them understand relationships between different concepts.
So instead of, like, the difference between fiction and nonfiction, it's teaching a computer the difference between Apple the fruit and Apple the company.
Exactly, and all the subtle ways those two concepts are connected and different. It's about taking raw, often messy information and making it make sense to a machine.
Wow, that's wild. No wonder RoleCatcher has a whole website dedicated to it. This is complex stuff. Why is this role becoming such a big deal now, though?
Well, the simple answer, demand. RoleCatcher states that job postings for knowledge engineers are exploding. We're talking a 30% year-over-year growth.
30%? That's huge. Double the average for other tech jobs, right?
Almost. It's a hot field, for sure. Companies are scrambling to find people who can bridge the gap between data and decision-making.
Makes sense. Data is only useful if you can actually, do something with it. So what are some of the actual day-to-day tasks of a knowledge engineer? What does that look like in practice?
It's a very diverse role, which is part of what makes it so interesting. RoleCatcher highlights stuff like designing and building knowledge bases, developing algorithms, and creating systems that can learn and adapt over time. You're not just building a static thing, you're building something that can grow and change.
So you need some serious technical chops, but also a lot of creativity. It's not just about crunching numbers. RoleCatcher also mentioned knowledge elicitation, which sounds like a mouthful. What does that even mean?
That's the human side of things I was talking about. Knowledge elicitation is basically the art of interviewing experts, figuring out how they think about a problem, and then translating that into something a computer can understand. It's like being a digital detective, uncovering hidden knowledge.
So you need to be able to speak both tech and human. That's a unique skill set. What kind of person excels in this kind of role?
Based on what we're seeing on RoleCatcher, you got to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. AI is constantly evolving, so a willingness to learn new things is essential, like nonstop learning.
Always one step ahead of the robots,
Yeah.
right? But what about the actual day-to-day environment? Is it all high-pressure coding marathons or what?
RoleCatcher seems to paint a picture of a pretty standard office environment, but they do emphasize the mentally demanding aspect of the job. Even if you're physically comfortable, you're using your brain in a big way every day.
Right, because even if you're not, like, physically building something, you're grappling with really complex concepts. It's not your typical 9 to 5, that's for sure.
Exactly. You're problem solving constantly, thinking critically, dealing with very intricate systems. It can be mentally tiring, even if you're not physically exhausted.
Okay, so intellectually stimulating, but potentially stressful if you're not prepared for it. Got it.
Yeah.
But for those up for the challenge, what does career progression look like? RoleCatcher had a whole section on that, didn't they?
Yeah, and it's actually pretty structured, which is interesting. You might start as a junior knowledge engineer, then move up to a knowledge engineer, senior, and eventually maybe even principal knowledge engineer, leading whole teams.
So there's a clear ladder to climb. You could go from assisting on projects to leading a whole knowledge management strategy. That's a cool trajectory.
It is, but it emphasizes that need for constant learning that we talked about. The field is always changing. You can't just learn one thing and be set for life. RoleCatcher really hammers that point home.
It's like being a perpetual student, always something new to master.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of which, they had a ton of different titles listed. ICT, Intelligent Systems Designer, Data Warehouse Designer, Ontologist. It seems like a really diverse field.
Totally. And that's one of the most exciting things about it. You can find your own niche within the broader world of knowledge engineer. The specific tasks might vary a lot depending on the company and the role itself.
So we've got a fast-growing, high-demand field, but it's also challenging and requires a very particular set of skills. What's the bottom line for someone considering this career path? What's the main takeaway from our deep dive into RoleCatcher?
For me, the biggest takeaway is that this isn't just about being good at tech. Yeah, you need a solid understanding of AI, machine learning, all that good stuff. But you also need to be incredibly curious, adaptable, and genuinely fascinated by knowledge itself.
It's as much about the knowledge part as the engineer part, it seems like.
100%. And let's not forget those communication skills we talked about. You need to be able to explain complex ideas clearly and simply, both verbally and in writing. That's huge GE in this role.
Right, because you're often the bridge between the tech folks and everyone else. You're translating between two different worlds, almost. So for those who love to learn, who enjoy solving puzzles, who maybe even want to teach a robot a thing or two, knowledge engineering might just be the perfect fit.
Absolutely. And if you're ready to dive in and learn more, well, you know where to find us.
We're always here to help navigate the ever-evolving world of exciting career paths. But let's get into some of the nitty-gritty details. Like, what does RoleCatcher say about the skills and qualifications you actually need to break into this field?
They've got a whole section dedicated to interview prep, which is like a gold mine of info on what companies are actually looking for.
Yeah, they really dove deep on that one, didn't they?
Mm.
This interview prep section is like having a cheat sheet, honestly. They even have sample interview questions.
Oh, for real. Okay, give me a hard one. What's the toughest question they threw out there?
Okay, brace yourself.
Yeah.
One question asks, can you explain the bias-variance trade-off in machine learning? Whoa, okay, yeah, that's a mouthful.
Yeah.
Can you translate that into plain English for us? Like, what does that even mean in practice?
So imagine you're trying to teach a computer to recognize a cat in a picture, right?
Okay, got a visual.
A high bias model, it might just learn that pointy ears equals cat. So then you show it a fox, and it gets confused.
Okay, exactly.
But then you have a high variance model, it might overthink things, like it memorizes every single cat picture it's ever seen. Then you show it a new cat, and it's like, nope, never seen that before.
So it's about finding the sweet spot. You need a system that's accurate, but also can adapt to new information.
Nailed it. That's the bias variance trade-off in a nutshell. And that's just one example of the kind of technical knowledge you need in this field. RoleCatcher's big on that. It's not just about knowing how to use the tools, you got to understand the principles behind them.
Right, you're not just a code monkey. You're like an AI whisperer. What other skills are we talking about here? What should aspiring knowledge engineers focus on?
Well, obviously programming is huge, Python especially. But RoleCatcher, they surprised me with this one. They put a ton of emphasis on communication skills.
Really? I would have thought it was all about, talking to computers, not people. Why communication?
Because remember, you're the bridge between the tech side and often people who are experts in their field but don't speak tech. You got to be able to explain these really complex concepts in a way that makes sense to everyone.
So you're not just a translator for machines, you're a translator for people too, facilitating that whole conversation.
Exactly. And that actually relates to something else RoleCatcher highlighted, the interconnected nature of this field. They have a whole section on adjacent career guides, and it's fascinating.
Oh yeah, I saw that. What are the careers we talking about here? Data entry, project management.
Think bigger. Data scientist, business intelligence analyst, even UX designer.
Wow, okay. From hardcore data crunching to, like, designing user interfaces, that's pretty wide spectrum.
It just goes to show that these skills, they're transferable. As tech keeps evolving, those lines are going to get blurrier and blurrier.
So there's no one set path to becoming a knowledge engineer, which I guess is kind of exciting, but also maybe a little overwhelming if you're just starting out. What advice does RoleCatcher give to newbies just dipping their toes in the water?
They keep coming back to this idea of building a strong foundation. AI, machine learning, knowledge representation, all that stuff we talked about. And of course, those communication skills.
Master the basics, and then the sky's the limit.
Pretty much. And don't be afraid to experiment, Build things, break things, network with people in the field.
Network, network, network. That's how you learn the good stuff. And speaking of learning, any resources RoleCatcher recommends for staying up to date. This field moves so fast.
They're big on online courses and certifications like Coursera, ADX, and conferences, of course. That's where you meet the people doing the really cool, cutting-edge work.
It's like they say, the learning never stops.
Yeah.
But I do want to circle back to something we touched on earlier, this idea of like the ethics of it all.
Oh, right, right. The responsibility.
Yeah, because we're not just talking about building a website here. We're talking about building the brains behind decisions, potentially big ones. That's a lot of weight on your shoulders. What does RoleCatcher say about that whole aspect of it?
Yeah, like are there best practices for making sure you're building ethical AI, or is that a whole other deep dive?
It's definitely a complex issue, but RoleCatcher does touch on it. In a way, they talk about work-life balance, actually.
Okay, interesting. I wouldn't have thought those two things went together. How so?
Well, they emphasize that work-life balance in this field, it can be all over the place. Depends on the company, the specific role, all that.
So it's not just about being a knowledge engineer, it's about finding the right company culture, the right environment for you.
Exactly. And that's where asking the right questions during interviews is crucial, they say. Don't be afraid to bring up work-life balance, company culture, all that stuff. Right, because if you're going to be spending late nights with these AI systems, you better make sure you're aligned with the company's values, their overall mission. Speaking of which, this whole RoleCatcher website, it's pretty in your face, you know? Like, they really want you to become a knowledge engineer.
Oh, yeah, they're not subtle about it. Super enthusiastic, which I guess makes sense given how in demand these skills are. But it did get me thinking, like, what's their angle? Why give away all this info for free?
Yeah, it's like, are they secretly funded by, like, a consortium of tech companies desperate for talent?
Maybe, but really it just goes to show the demand is there. When everyone wants to hire knowledge engineers, you got to get creative to attract people.
Free resources, it's the new billboard ad. So, for anyone listening who's like, all right, I'm convinced, sign me up, what's the one thing we want them to remember from our RoleCatcher deep dive? What's the key takeaway?
I think it boils down to this. It's about more than just technical skills. Yes, you need those. Absolutely. The AI, the machine learning, all of that. But you also need that intellectual curiosity, that drive to keep learning, and a real passion for knowledge itself.
It's not just a job, it's a whole mindset.
Yeah.
You're not just building systems, you're shaping the future of how we understand and use information.
Exactly. And never underestimate those communication skills, that ability to bridge the gap between the tech and everyone else.
So if you're someone who loves to learn, who loves solving puzzles, who maybe even wants to, like, teach a robot a thing or two, knowledge engineering might just be the perfect path for you.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
And hey, if you ever feel lost in the sea of data, you know where to find us. Thanks for diving deep with us on the deep dive. We'll catch you next time as we explore another fascinating career path. Until then, keep those brains engaged and those curiosity gears turning.